Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to settle in and get started in just a second. So there's still, if you are standing in the back and you would like a seat, there's still a few seats left in the overflow room, but feel free to stand there as well. Glad that the room is packed. Obviously excitement for this topic and this panel, which is great. Just a little bit of context. Last year, when we did the climate track of the Yale Innovation Summit, some of the feedback that we got was we would really love to hear from capital providers, VCs, who are just doing interesting, creative work and have real topical expertise and understanding. And so we went out into the Yale network and we looked around and we found some pretty incredible folks who have been thoughtful, engaged, considerate in building theses and then wanting to present their problems and these problem statements and theses publicly. So we have three of those folks who are going to give you sort of short pitches. Now this is called a reverse pitch, but we're not awarding any money here. And we're not really judging anything. What we wanted to do is also make sure that these three folks were supported by four individuals with expertise across areas and sectors of building products, providing capital, understanding the science, really considering what it looks like to incubate and support entrepreneurs. And so how could they help these VCs in front of you all kind of consider the shape and scope of that problem? And so what we're going to have is these short, bursty pitches from these lovely folks who've agreed to do this. And then we're going to have a few questions clarifying from the folks who are here in front. And you can see them all on the screen. And then we're going to do that 3 times. And then we're going to bring all these folks up here. And Ryan is going to facilitate a discussion, Ryan Dings, who is our moderator for today, amongst the judges. And then we'll pull you all in at the end. Sound good? All right. Is everybody clear on where we're going? How we're going to get there? All right, great. So thanks to everybody for being here, and real pleasure to turn it over to Ryan Dings. This is Ryan, who is the CEO, the founding CEO of Climate Haven, the climate tech incubator we have. And this is sort of like his crowning moment or last moment in the role as he's moving on to another one. And we're currently in a search for someone to replace his big shoes. But it's been an absolute thrill to build with him over 18 months. Climate Haven's been wildly successful in large part to the team that you've built and the people that support around him. So it's a real treat, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you, Stu. Surely a lot of our success is due to the amazing board of directors we have at Climate Haven. And I'm glad to still be on that board and still be a part of Climate Haven. But if anybody is interested in taking my job, come find me afterwards and we can talk more about what Climate Haven is all about. But right now, we are here to talk about reverse pitches. And allow me to set the stage for 60 seconds as to why the reverse pitch is so useful when it comes to climate tech. We have this challenge in climate technology, and that is that the externality that we are all trying to address, which is carbon, or greenhouse gas emissions, a little more broadly, is not priced. The fundamental externality that we are trying to address is not priced. So entrepreneurs are out there working really hard, tirelessly, every day to create technologies that are aiming to decarbonize our planet. And it's a big question mark as to whether those technologies can actually become products, viable products, and whether those viable products can actually become the basis of a scalable, enduring company. And so the beauty of the reverse pitch is that we get to hear from the investors themselves, the ones who are bear the responsibility to put capital to work, not to just decarbonize the planet, but to generate a return on their investment. And we get to hear from them as to exactly what those problems are that they see. There's no doubt that there are amazing entrepreneurs working in this space. I work alongside them and invest in a number of them, but what we have to do is work with those entrepreneurs and help those entrepreneurs understand what it takes to turn their technology into a viable product and make that viable product the basis of an enduring company. I remember about a decade ago, and this makes me feel a bit old to say it was, in 2014, I was at a conference like this, a clean energy conference, walking around with an investor in one of my previous companies whom I had just lost a lot of money on his behalf. And we were walking around, and he said to me something very simple, but still rings true today. And that is, he said, boy, there are too many solutions in search of problems. And I remember those words. And every time I'm meeting with an entrepreneur, that's one of the first things I think. Is this a solution in search of a problem? What we want to do is solve problems and do it in an economically viable way. So let's hear from some amazing investors. Let's hear some questions from an amazing panel. And let's see what they can offer over the next hour. I thank you for all for being with us. And first up, Peter Yallis.
My family spent summers up in a little lake in up northern Michigan called Green Lake. And during the days, we'd play on the beach, and I'd go swimming and fishing with my grandparents. Sometimes I had to struggle to make it out to the raft swimming, but I'd make it back. And, you know, the traditional peoples think of water as sacred. And we often think about water as a family member. I'm curious, raise your hand if you have a special memory from growing up where you spent time in a lake, river, or pond. Those memories are really special, and we want to protect those. And that's why I founded Echo River Capital, to invest in companies that digitize, decentralize water and wastewater treatment, and decarbonize the water cycle. Today we have 20 companies in a portfolio that do one of those things. They're global companies from founder to seed stage. And we're trying to harmonize the freshwater cycle with humanity and ecosystems. One of the problems, though, with water today is that water is the way that climate change is primarily affecting the world. In fact, insurance companies today think that the majority of insurable damages are going to come from the water cycle, from more frequent and deeper droughts, from deluges and floods, and sea level rise. So there are some big challenges out there, but water is not just the transmission of climate change. Water is also the source of greenhouse gas emissions. These are hidden emissions that people don't think about today. They come from carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. In fact, about 5% or half of these 10% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from the built environment, moving, heating, and treating water. And the other half, about 5%, comes from the natural environment, irrigating, from reservoirs, methane emissions, etc. So I'm out looking for solutions to decarbonize these parts of the water cycle. So there are huge opportunities here. We can uncover a lot of these emissions. We think we can decarbonize up to about 2 gigatons. That's 1,000 million tons per year of greenhouse gas emissions that comes from water management. And by doing so, we can protect 60% of the global GDP that is reliant on water and wastewater services. About $7.5 trillion from direct use, from drinking, industrial use, and irrigated agriculture, and another $50 trillion of ecosystem services that water and wetlands and rivers provide us. So we can protect that as well. And that's also increasing the investable opportunity. A recent report by Global Water Intelligence shows that the value of water security, investable value of water security today per year, 3.8 trillion, and is likely to triple in the next 10 years. So where are a lot of these emissions coming from today? A deeper dive. Reservoirs, flood, plant matter, and that creates methane that emits. And so that's a big problem. Wetlands, when they desiccate, they can emit methane. So here the darker bars are carbon dioxide and the lighter bars are methane emissions. So you can see wetlands and rivers. The pollution from rivers creates a lot of CO2, etc. So over 15 gigatons of emissions coming from the freshwater systems today. Two of the companies that I've recently invested in are addressing both the built environment and the natural environment for emissions. On the left, the darker triangle, the 323 million tons are coming from water and wastewater treatment, and Crew Carbon is a Yale spinout, which is using enhanced rock weathering, and they inject that limestone material into the wastewater stream to sequester carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide with their first pilot right here in New Haven. On the right side, the 1,000 million tons of CO2 are coming from reservoirs and river emissions. And a recent investment is a company called Open Hydro, which is a software platform based in Europe that will monitor, track, and help reoperate reservoirs and the wetlands that surround them to reduce emissions. This system can help reoperate and reduce emissions from reservoirs by 30 to 50%. So these are some examples of companies that are going to do that. And I hope that with these investments, we'll be able to help all of our children around the world enjoy their rivers and lake experiences and create those memories that will be lasting for a lifetime. So thank you.
Could you hold on to that mic for 1 second? We're going to sit down and listen to questions from our panel later, but a couple of quick things here off the bat. Anybody? Yes, sir.
So water is a huge topic. I'm just curious, what's the low-hanging fruit you see for entrepreneurs, and what skill sets are required to attack those problems?
The low-hanging fruit is in the decarbonization space, is looking at those direct emissions that we know and can track. So methane has been not regulated until recently. And so we can go after where those methane emissions are occurring and try to decarbonize those primarily industrial processes. So industries can act faster and have much more concentrated decision-making authority, but primarily what I'm looking for from founders is that they've identified the emission source and a significant economic pain point that's felt by those industrial customers.
Thanks so much, Peter. So wastewater, water, slow-moving sectors overall. A lot of these municipal partners are really slow in how they do their engagements and their contracts. How do you think about returning a fund? And you've already touched on how you select for entrepreneurs, but what do you think are good problems, and what do you think are actually quite problems that would not fit your fund?
I do think that there's a myth that it's a slow-moving sector, and I think it's very specific to the municipal utility sector. So I've tried to limit my exposure in the fund to about 20% of the fund to municipal customers. Industrials are actually moving very, very quickly now. Over 250 Fortune 500 companies have signed the CEO water mandate and to do more water stewardship, to track and report on their water and wastewater use and the carbon emissions related to their water use. So this is new in the last couple of years, and it's really accelerating. So large Fortune 500 companies are doing that, and there are some huge opportunities that are happening now. For example, in AI and data centers, water use is accelerating proportionally to compute power for cooling. So I think companies like that are operating in that type of space are going to do very well.
Hi, Peter. One question here is this sort of the thing that we heard earlier, is that sometimes there's too many solutions for the problem out there. I'm not suggesting that's the case with water, but one thing I've seen is a lot of firms focused on climate tech, a lot of firms. So when you're looking at an investment and thinking about which one you'll invest in, what are the things that are key to you to avoid or to invest in?
I do agree that there are a lot of technology solutions looking for customers. And it's a big problem, right? We have to invert that and look for what the pain points are and try to solve for those. So that is, to reiterate, a huge problem. So I'm looking for also founders that understand the customer return on investment calculation and can do that in their sleep. So many times they might identify a problem and try to address it, but they don't know how it's going to benefit their customer. And this is something I have to go over again and again and explain it to them and actually demonstrate like an example of how to do that. It's just a simple addition calculation, but they haven't gone through the steps to think through what the issue is from the customer's perspective. And I really want them to do that. So that really helps address that future scaling ramp. If they can find that where customers are going to buy it day after day because it helps them, we know that's going to be a solution that scales.
Thank you.
So one last question for me. What does the profile of your founders generally tend to be? Do you find it's more kind of impact people or more kind of like hard-nosed technologists? Can you tell us a bit more of like the ideal founder profile from your point of view?
What we usually see are people who understand the policy or the science, and that's where investors can really help them understand and grow their business. What I'd like to see is more people coming from outside the water industry who can bring their skill set from finance or technology or telecom or energy and realize that they have a passion for water and they want to bring that to the water sector to solve these massive problems that we talked about.
Awesome. All right, we're going to do more questions later. Thank you, Peter, though. Right. So, Peter, thank you so much. One down and two more to go. And when we are finished with the other two presentations, we will bring everybody up and we'll do Q&A from both the panel and the audience. All right. So as we switch slides, I would like to welcome David Guilford from Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners. David.
Thanks so much, Ryan. It's great to be here. As Ryan said, my name is David Guilford with Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, and I think it's fitting to follow Peter's discussion about our sort of natural infrastructure and the role that water plays with looking at something that's on the other end of the spectrum, and that's digital infrastructure. So as you probably all know, the cloud isn't really a cloud. The cloud is a bunch of computers that are just out of sight, that are using a lot of energy and creating a big environmental impact. At Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, or SIP for short, we were formed to look at how to apply technology to infrastructure systems from energy to transportation to waste and help leverage that innovation to solve the challenges that lurk beneath the surface in infrastructure. We were fortunate to have deep ties to the tech world. We spun out of Alphabet about 5 years ago with investments from major infrastructure investors, pension funds, and others. That's me. I am happy to be back here. I was a SOM graduate myself and now have the privilege of establishing public-private partnerships to work between sectors to help solve some of these problems. As I alluded to, data centers are already responsible for a large environmental impact. The most recent estimates are on the order of 300 million tons of CO2 emitted per year directly due to data centers, and that's not even counting the construction and other water impacts and more. As you probably mostly know, 300 million tons of CO2 translates into a lot. That's the same as what the UK emits in a year, or it's the same as 3.7 million flights back and forth across the country. And that's bad enough, but if you look at the trends, this has really been accelerating. Back in 2021, the estimates were that by the end of this decade, data centers would be using something like 1 to 3% of global electricity use by 2030. And that's already pretty staggering, but that was before ChatGPT launched and before a lot of new companies and a lot of excitement has led to the growth of even more digital infrastructure. So the predictions for the amount of electricity that data centers require goes up almost every week. And the uncertainty makes it very difficult to plan whether you are a grid operator, a power provider, or an end user of data centers. At the same time, the tech companies that are using this, they're using all this capacity, recognize that they need to make their data centers more sustainable, and they've made big commitments from Google to Facebook to Microsoft around having 24/7 carbon-free compute. And that, if you think about the great work that's gone into developing large-scale solar and other renewables, the challenge is matching that to data centers that traditionally have located where they had cheap 100% capacity factor, as close to 100% capacity factor energy as possible. But if we think about what this means as we add tens of gigawatts of new data center capacity onto the grid, our whole power infrastructure is really in jeopardy. And I don't think that's a hyperbole. Just thinking about the past 24 hours, we've seen the effects of climate change and storms in Texas. 800,000 people lost power last night. I think in Connecticut, there's 100,000 or so that lost power. And so we can't expect that adding tens of gigawatts of new data centers is going to just happen without there being a change in the infrastructure underlying that. So also, as I alluded to, the amount of new generation is growing, but it's primarily on the intermittent side. And as we all know, solar and wind in particular have become very cost competitive, but they also are not always on. And in certain markets, and this is just an illustrative example for Dominion in Northern Virginia, which is one of the biggest data center markets in the country, the growth in electricity load is entirely driven by data centers. So we're going from a period of flat growth to now a few percent a year, which when you add up across the power needs of this country is really staggering. And the previous panel talked a bit about the interconnection queue and the challenges of bringing new generation onto the grid. There's an equivalent challenge going on the load side or on the demand side. And some of the early examples were from Europe, from places like Amsterdam and Dublin, but it's spread to Santa Clara, California, Northern Virginia. And what this means is that in some cases, a developer who has a project they want to build, they have land, they have the permits, but it's going to take 5 to 10 years for them to get connected to the grid. At the same time, you have energy developers who are also waiting 5 to 10 years to connect to the grid. So this really shows that there is a need for innovation and a need for a way to balance the growth in supply that we all want and are working towards with this seemingly insatiable demand for new capacity for data centers. And last but not least, I think we've seen the trends in weather as I alluded to, but just thinking about a hot summer afternoon in a place like Arizona, which has experienced some of the most rapid data center growth. Data centers need power all the time, typically. And 5 o'clock on a sunny afternoon where it's 110 degrees in Phoenix, the sun starts to go down. How can the grid handle the increase in air conditioning usage as people go home, potentially charge their EVs, but also all the data centers want to stay on? That's a fundamental question. I think something that we need innovation from all sectors, but certainly on the entrepreneurial side, I'm very interested in solutions that can help find a better path forward. So, I guess in closing, we know that we need more compute, whether it's for AI or high performance computing or just all the services that we all rely on a daily basis now. And so we can't say no more data centers, but we need to design them in a way that is friendly to the grid, that is friendly to the environment, and that can accelerate rather than hinder the energy transition that we're going through. So with that, I'd be happy to get into questions. There's also a topic that we published a white paper on, datacenterflexibility.com, thinking about some solutions. I know the point of today is to talk about the problem and the challenges, but I do think it's an area where we should think about the evolution to a more flexible model. Thanks very much.
All right, so my good presentation. My question was going to be picking up on what you said. What have been the most interesting kind of startups that you've seen in this space? I saw that Sam Altman invested $375 million in a kind of nuclear kind of startup. Should we be looking at that kind of stuff, or what do you think are kind of some of? If I'm an enterprising entrepreneur, what should I be thinking about potentially doing to solve this? And I guess related to that, what's the best business model that you've seen? Because it seems like a very large problem, but who's really going to pay for it? If I'm a founder, how do I create a sustainable business model?
Yeah, it's an excellent question because there's several different aspects through which you can tackle this. There's the power generation, basically of just how do we produce a 100 megawatts, in some cases a gigawatt for a particular data center, and keep that on in a way that is not adding new thermal, gas burning generation onto the grid. And so the interest in small modular reactors in particular is because that can precisely match the profile of the having that density of power and a high capacity factor in a given location, and perhaps reduce the need for a lot of transmission infrastructure. But that's a hard thing to tackle as a startup, right? I mean, if you're Sam Altman, perhaps you can put money into companies that are 5, 10, 15 years out, perhaps from commercialization. Particularly thinking about fusion, which continues to be both have a lot of excitement, but always 10 plus years away. But that's not the only opportunity for entrepreneurs. You can think about the software side of this even. If I am a entrepreneur that is building some new tool and I need to use a data center because that's everyone is using data centers for the cloud, maybe there are ways to choose where that processing is happening based on the carbon intensity of the grid at the moment, or based on power prices. So you can make trade-offs in data centers that are things like how much latency is okay. Is it okay adding an extra 10 milliseconds and have the processing take place right now in a place that has a lot of wind available, for example? is it okay to pause the training of my AI model for a few hours because it is 110 degrees in Phoenix or whatever the case may be? So I think there's both the kind of software orchestration of that there's opportunities for startups, but there's also just how do you put together a business model where you're financing the investments in, say, batteries. If you going back to the IRA and the ITC, there are ways now where you have a big market of potential users in the form of these large tech companies and the data center developers themselves. So if you can figure out ways to integrate not just renewables but also storage into projects, it's a whole sort of other class of potential customers that I think people could look at.
Thank you. It was so great to hear your presentation. This question is more from the perspective of an IPP, so an independent power producer. I sit on the board of a company that has wind, solar, and natural gas peaker plants. And the idea being this idea of intermittency and reliability, et cetera. And they're starting to look at, the grid and all the issues that you've mentioned, as well as the up and down of the things that have happened in Texas, the pricing, and also seeing the demand from data centers. And so the question is, they may at this point be more incentivized to work directly with the data centers rather than trying to deal with the grid and all of these other things, which then hurts maybe the people living in Arizona that have 110 degrees weather. So how should they be thinking about that, or how would you engage with someone like them to help solve this problem?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this gets back to the challenge we have in the U.S. where we don't have a coordinated national approach to any of this. So there's so much regional specificity in a lot of these solutions. I think, to the point about how. So Amazon's another example here where Amazon Web Services essentially bought a nuclear power plant recently and then set basically to put a data center behind the fence and avoid the whole transmission and distribution grid completely. And on the one hand, you're saying, you could look at that and say, that's great because now it's zero carbon compute, but that's not, and there's no new clean generation that was added as a result of that, which is the challenge. But to your point on the sort of who pays the cost, I think is critical, because you also have situations where there are hundreds of millions of dollars of new capital costs going into that a utility is incurring to bring bring 100 megawatts of new power to a particular site. In some cases, that cost is then socialized across the entire rate base. So you may end up with individual consumers paying more because your bill includes helping the utility recover the cost of that capex for a very specific client. So there's a lot in there, but I think that there's the ability to reduce pushing externalities out to others. I think if innovation can do that, can reduce that by citing large load with large generation, making it more flexible, I think ultimately you end up with better outcomes for everyone.
All right, one more question from the panel, and then on to our next presenter.
Yeah, thanks. So if I'm an entrepreneur, let's say I'm developing a software tool to enable flexible AI, so now data centers can provide grid flexibility. Like where is that incentivized? Who's going to pay me to do that? Where is the value, and who is paying for that?
Yeah, so I think it depends a bit on how there's on like what the value proposition is that you're offering, and obviously that translates into who will pay for it. If it's something that reduces the cloud costs for other companies, you could imagine some sort of B2B approach there. The challenge on the other side, if you're basically trying to optimize the operations of one of these hyperscale compute users themselves, is they have huge teams. So I wouldn't recommend necessarily if you raise $10 million and you're trying to build something to make data centers more energy efficient, you have to think about how much money is Google or Microsoft or Amazon putting into that sort of R&D every year, and just think about those market dynamics. But if it's something instead that helps the thousands of smaller companies that are either struggling with the cloud costs themselves or that are building more locally specific applications, I think there's probably a bigger opportunity there.
David, thank you. All right, a big thank you to David. We've got one more presenter left while we pull up slides. Stu, what's my cap on dad jokes for the panel?
Probably.
3?
Yeah.
3? All right.
At the end, you can have 2 during.
All right. Why was 6 afraid of 7?
Why?
No, Seven had a lot of face tattoos. All right, enough of that. We've got this is why I'm the moderator and not pitching during this. All right, so we've got one final presenter, and I'm very happy and excited to welcome Sam Grassel from Elemental Accelerator. Sam.
One sec. Awesome. Are we seeing the slide?
Should have told another dad.
Unfortunately, don't.
How about a mom joke?
Yeah, there we go.
Oh gosh, I have a 2-year-old, so you don't want to know. Awesome. That'll work. All right. Well, I'll just get started while we're waiting. So hi everyone. I'm Sam Grassley. I'm with Elemental Accelerator. I work on the policy lab team. And for you guys who aren't familiar with us, we're a nonprofit investor that focuses on scaling climate tech companies with deep community impact. Let me see. So where I spend a lot of time actually is related to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. I know a lot of you guys heard a lot about that this morning, but just want to recognize that this is just an incredible moment when the EPA announced the $27 billion to capitalize national and local financing institutions. We are really excited about that opportunity to use to help scale climate technologies. So we've been really deeply involved in these efforts, and we're in a position to deploy capital towards qualified projects starting this summer. But I'm going to just take us up a level and talk about the big problems that we see when investing in climate and where we hope people will focus solutions. So programs like the GGRF are just now going to start flowing to companies in our portfolios, but we know that these dollars can't come soon enough. Last year, we saw a 30% drop in climate investment, and I know a lot of people in this room are probably feeling that a lot right now. So it's really important that we don't lose momentum and that the climate companies that we've been building in these last few years continue to grow. And so I'm going to take you through a set of challenges that we're really laser focused on addressing and hope to convince you to incorporate this in your investing strategy too. So our team has analyzed thousands of climate companies that are operating today in partnership with the Earthshot Ventures team and Vibrant Data Labs. And we found that there are thousands of early stage companies that have recently been started, and just about 700 that were started last year alone. So the influx into climate is really huge and undeniable. But right now we know that 75% of climate companies fail. And this is par of the course for the course with venture. But we must do what we can to address the gap and achieve what's possible. And we can't afford to lose technologies because of avoidable capital gaps, especially those that are going to deliver community benefits. So of all the thousands of companies that have been started, there are only about 600 that we know that are operating at scale in climate, and we need thousands to reduce it to the emissions levels that we need. So 45% of reductions will be delivered by technologies that are not yet at scale. So that's really important that these technologies exist today, but are not operating yet at scale. And so these are really important, ranging from clean drinking water. Peter spoke about this a little earlier, sustainable materials, regenerative agriculture, and there's a big gap between this early stage enthusiasm and companies operating at scale. And it's not just a capital gap, it's workforce, it's community engagement, permitting, many other factors that are really important deploying in the real world and make it really difficult and complex. And so there are 3 things that we think that companies need to cross the bridge. The first is catalytic capital. Our research shows that it will take at least $100 billion in the next few years to enable companies to cross the bridge. And what's going to make this capital move? We need catalytic capital that will de-risk projects and attract traditional capital. So in the audience today, we have Marshall Cox from Calvin, a proud Elemental portfolio member. Calvin is decarbonizing legacy buildings through low-cost heat pumps and thermal storage. Catalytic capital, which we were talking about with them about through multiple projects, would allow them to expand a subscription model to more LMI households, bringing the cost down from $15 to $10 a month, and helping scale the business to new legacy buildings that have been left out due to factors like a lack of credit history. And so after proving out this model with catalytic capital, Calvin will be able to replicate, set a precedent, and make it appealing for the private sector to come in. We've seen that even a small amount of catalytic capital available now through things like loans and grants has had an impact, and these companies have a 30% higher success rate. There's also a mismatch between where the dollars are going and where the emissions need to be reduced. In transportation, personal mobility has attracted 5 times more investment than commercial transportation, even though they account for roughly the same GHG emissions. And across most of the challenges we're facing, we see that the VC is not going directly to the areas of highest emissions. So we need catalytic capital to both address, reduce the risk, and also bring capital to the areas that need that are most needed to reduce GHG emissions. So the second thing, and where I spend a lot of my time, is project expertise. Entrepreneurs are really good at raising venture capital, developing innovative products, and serving customers. And this is table stakes to be an entrepreneur, but it's not enough in climate. Companies working across sectors need the expertise to make emissions reductions happen in the real world. And so this is through sexy things like permitting and setting up project structures, and really typically need to get that on the team. At Elemental, we're training for this. We rolled out services like fractional CFOs, developers, and residents to really help entrepreneurs get to that next stage of project development. And these services are just as popular as the capital that we provide. So this is the most exciting element that Elemental likes to bring, and that's community partnership. We believe that community engagement is the key to the next chapter of climate deployment. We've learned this from working on the ground in Hawaii, across the US now, and the globe, that you have to work with community partners to get your projects off the ground in a meaningful way. Through initiatives like the Inflation Reduction Act, this is now a requirement for winning funding in many cases. And so we believe that, it's a good business decision as well. And we've seen that 95% of our portfolio have worked with community partners, and the vast majority have said that it's supported successful project outcomes. So just to summarize, these are the 3 things that we hope to convince you of that to help companies cross the bridge. We need catalytic capital that by definition attracts other funders. We need to ensure that companies have killer project expertise. And we need to give companies and community partners the tools to work with projects with real community benefits. Just at Elemental alone, we've sourced over 300 projects that are ready to be deployed now and just lack the access to financing and need a little bit of extra support to get them across the finish line. We've done some analysis, and these would create 44,000 jobs and reduce more than 200 million tons of CO2 emissions, which is equivalent to the state of Florida. So the last piece of good news is that there's some amazing opportunities on the other side of the bridge, and more capital than ever in history. There's 121 billion of private equity ready to fund climate. There's also the 27 billion I mentioned from the GGRF, but we need the tools to get to the other side. And that's the only way we're going to achieve the 45% of emissions reductions that rely on tech that hasn't yet scaled. A final shameless plug. We are now open to looking for our next cohort of companies. The deadline is tomorrow. But if you have not heard of us or know a really amazing company, come talk to me or Sadie in the audience. We would love to share more about the opportunity. This year, we're offering between $350 and $3 million for companies that join our cohort. And that is it.
All right, a couple of quick questions for Sam, and then we're going to invite the other speakers down, and we'll do Q&A with both the panel and the audience.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks so much for this. One thing that was really striking to me as you were going through this presentation is the combination of capital, expertise, and partners. It's often a model that's actually used in like non-governmental sectors, right? To bring, like I was thinking of the World Bank, that's kind of what they brand themselves on as well. So I guess my question to you is, I'm curious to get your take on why you think capital and VC in the private sector is actually the right vehicle to fund this kind of model through versus maybe non-governmental partners or that another kind of organizational structure.
Yeah, I think from talking to our portfolio companies, we just haven't seen them getting access to that capital in the way that they need. We're pretty lucky in that we're a nonprofit and we have the flexibility to do these creative structures. But I think the important thing is that they need to exist. They need to exist a lot for us to be able to get these companies to further on the scale. So yeah, I would say yes, and that there needs to be way more players doing this kind of work.
Thanks. So I have two quick questions. One is, you started the presentation by saying you need $100 billion to kind of get the effects, but then at the end you closed by saying there's going to be $120 billion. So it looks like things are pretty good, unless I missed something.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's that's waiting on the other side, but this is all the capital we also need now to get there. So yeah.
And then the other question was, in terms of startups not scaling, usually that's because they haven't found a business model to kind of get through the valley of death. So how are you helping companies find sustainable business models that would be attractive to VCs because they can see a pathway to an exit?
Yeah, so we have multiple tracks to join Elemental, and this kind of varies on the stage that you're at. In that earlier stage that you're talking about figuring out business models, that's our strategy track, and that's really like where we come in. We bring coaching and expertise. We help companies figure out those fundamentals to help get to the next. But then we have companies joining at the project stage where they have mature technology, they have the business model, but they need to scale to multiple deployments. And that's where we provide funding for those projects to be able to get them off the ground. So we work at multiple levels. We're increasingly further along in the commercialization stages, both because these companies are growing up and also because there's tons of opportunity now for this missing middle that we're talking about of like bringing those companies over.
Thank you for your presentation. In terms of the catalytic capital piece, I assume that's below market rate return capital that you're talking about?
A lot of cases it's concessionary, but sometimes it's just flexible things that people haven't done before that are willing to take a risk of first of a kind of financing structure. So yeah, a lot of times it's a synonym, but sometimes it could be still market rate, but just a different structure that no one else has been willing to do because it hasn't been replicated before.
Okay, so one thing I'm wondering is, in the impact investing space, I would say there's a range of players, and my sense is that there's a view that there's a lot more impact investor, non-concessionary or concessionary capital return players than there actually are out there in terms of providing that types of funding.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious, where have you seen sort of the strongest players in that space? Are they large foundations, et cetera? And then the second is, the other things that I've seen be successful is sort of more blended finance approach where you have, grants stacked on PRIs, stacked on private capital. So I'm just curious how you thought about there, if you've explored that as well.
Yeah, I think that for the first question, definitely philanthropy has been this sort of space where they're willing to be creative and also, provide that concessionary capital that's sort of like combined with ours. And the blended model is definitely what we're striving for in all of these projects, to unlock like what can we do on our side to sort of make it more appealing for the private sector to come in, like how does that pencil out, and to make a project move forward. And this is like a ton of the work that we're doing around the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, because it's a requirement that we have to mobilize private capital. And so this is just like the next level of how we get that going forward.
Just one quick last question. What metrics do you apply? How do you determine which companies are right for this kind of funding? Presumably it's sort of a different set of metrics than other kinds of investments.
Yeah. I would say right now it's more art than science. Probably we evaluate the opportunity, evaluate the ability to scale, and based on the deployments that have already happened. Obviously, these are companies that are proven technologies that are now just going to be expanding more. It's not a really apples to apples across sectors. But we sort of look at those things of like, is it able to, would it unlock capital if we can risk it? We're looking at it also as like, is this something that we are additional, so we are coming in and making this project happen, because we don't want to be duplicating something that the private sector could and should just come in and do. So there's a range of things, and we're sort of now we're figuring out and trying to standardize around sectors, but those are like primary things we look for.
Awesome, Sam. Thank you so much. All right, so we're going to welcome all of our panelists down. David and Peter can join Sam, I will ask the judges to think of a few other burning questions that they want to discuss, but also open it up to the audience. If any of the audience members have questions that they want to ask, folks feel free. So we'll start with an audience question. See one hand pop up back there. Come over here, and then we'll come back to the judges. So think about our panel. So think about some more burning questions. Go ahead, sir.
It's a question for David. It may be out of scope since you were talking about software, but have you guys thought about how, since the just scaling of data centers, have you thought about how you might be able to valorize the waste heat from data centers?
Yeah,
Repeat the question so that the other room can hear it.
yeah. So the question was around thinking about the waste heat from data centers and what that might be used for. Short answer, we've looked at that. We haven't found an opportunity that works. I think the most out of the box stuff that I've seen is around kind of capturing that and putting it into district heating type applications. It's generally the heat coming out of a data center is substantial, but it's not enough to run a lot of like industrial processes. But that said, I think cooling is such a big part of data centers that I think that it is a fertile area for exploration. The other sorts of things I've seen is using, there's Microsoft had a pilot of submersible data centers that they put it underwater. There's lots of creative ways people have tried to do to get around the challenge of all the heat coming off of data centers.
Maybe can I add on to that? So one of the companies in Echo River's portfolio is a company called Uravu, which uses industrial waste heat, including data centers, to power atmospheric water generation, which then can be reused to cool the data centers even more. So that's one idea.
You hold on to it. Mark, good to see you.
Great to see you. We'll catch up. Question for Peter and David, if I could, real quick. One, Peter, how are carbon credits or water credits playing into the investments company's business as a financing tool? And then, David, for you, if I could, per the narrative, what you can measure, you can manage, or in this case, climate. How are your investment companies quantifying the carbon intensity of the data centers to make better informed decisions?
The best way for me to answer the question about carbon credits in water and wastewater is to use Crew Carbon as an example, which is creating carbon credits from the sequestration of carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide in wastewater treatment. However, so the carbon credit sale is being used to fund the profitability of the company, but I don't think carbon credits are a good source of value for the customer. We've helped the Crew Carbon identify a customer ROI that's based on cost reduction, not on the sale of the credits. So I've tried to help them sort of bifurcate that, and I think that's super important.
To the question on how we see companies measuring the carbon impact of their data center use, I think one positive change over the past few years is that it's now kind of table stakes for cloud providers to share that level of transparency through dashboards and other reporting. I think the challenge becomes, though, that because we're still not in a world where there is a true one-to-one matching of clean energy to compute, it's sometimes hard to disentangle, the degree to which, say, like RECs are used to offset the impact of the energy consumption, as well as just like the local impacts. Because I think, I was trying to portray the problem from the like macro grid perspective, because sometimes it's like things balance out on average, but it still results in problems in a particular area, right? So you might have, a company might be consuming compute from a data center that has 100% clean energy through power purchase agreements, but it's not all happening in the same place. Like if you're doing your processing in Silicon Valley, California, but the generation is actually coming from Oregon or somewhere else like that, there's still a little bit of an externality in there around sort of wheeling and moving that power around that doesn't get fully captured, I think, in some of the metrics that people use.
All right, back to our judges for some questions. Oh, I'm sorry. By all means.
So we run a small fund here in Connecticut, a small early stage fund impact, all women LPs. So just from an investment standpoint, how, any suggestions and, obviously wanting to support these companies that are farther along, but the valuations aren't through the roof. We're just struggling to find that sweet spot. So just any suggestions on that? I know that's like the million, the unicorn question, but we've got capital, we've got women LPs, we want to support, but it seems like when we find something, it's like the valuation's like crazy. So then, but then when it's so early stage, it's
the business model hasn't been proven, so we're, or there's no lead investor, so we're just, finding that sort of.
Yeah, so so at Elemental, we really focus on traditionally excluded founders, and that's a real priority for us as well. And so our portfolio is about 50% women or people of color. I think that connecting with the networks that have the same focus as you is like, I'm constantly talking about to funds that are focused on women, focused on founders, people of color, and getting that sort of like pipeline through those. I'm sure you're doing that already.
We are seeing a lot, it just seems like there's just that middle ground has been, like I said, we're seeing tons of early or really great companies that are 45, 50 million valuation, which is just at our stages.
Yeah. Well, I think that like the way we really look at from a project perspective, and I think we're really different in that we do equity investments, but we'll scope those around a project. And so if companies are willing to work with you on those type of things, like that could be a place where maybe you add a unique value and they're able to work with you on a specific project. That's how we've typically worked through those. But yeah, we're sometimes a lot of companies are too late and we're not providing value that they need, and that's okay. There's lots of opportunities, and being that center for them to like bring them to, all these funds that we talked about through GGRF, like that could be a good phase for them as well. So that's how we're looking at it.
My audience periphery is not good, sorry.
That's all good, thank you. The question's for Peter. You had been asked a question by the panel around sort of the backgrounds of founders that you look at. And mentioned specifically, wishing for a bit of more of a finance background in some of the founders. In the instance that they don't have that sort of technical skill set, when do you advise or nudge them to bring that in-house?
As soon as possible. But you can get that as an advisor, right? You can get a lot of free research. I'm a former entrepreneur and founder myself, right? Taking a company from founding to exit. And I looked and I got so much help. If you're a founder, there are a lot of free resources available. You just have to ask. I can't tell you how many dozens or probably hundreds of people supported our enterprise without payment, without compensation. They really wanted to help contribute to the success of the company in whatever skill set that they had. And I'm a big, believer in looking for and asking for whatever it is that you need.
I might just add on to that the sort of plus one on the resources side of things. So I used to work in New York City's economic development agency and found that there often was just a lack of awareness among founders of some of the pretty easy to access programs. I'm not talking about like big grant programs, but things like having the state funded a EIR program where essentially would pair someone with deep finance or operating company experience and pay for their costs to advise a startup. And surprisingly, there were a lot of people I would talk to who had not heard about that, and so there's sometimes a bit of a marketing challenge, especially given just how much is going on generally in a city or in a large ecosystem. That I think that finding those things that are not distractions and they're not going to, you're not going to wait 2 years to get a check from the government and meanwhile need to raise money in the interim, but like things where you can, in a matter of weeks, get some support, I think are critical.
Do we have any other audience questions before we come back? Yes.
Hi, I'm Joanna Bingham. I run Footprints Africa. We work with companies who are targeting social and environmental impact across Africa. I wanted to pick up on the gentleman who opened the session talked about the fact that carbon's not being priced. And we find that a lot of the companies that we work with create so much more value than they're able to capture and monetize. And so my question has two parts. The first part is to ask about examples of alternative business models or revenue streams that you've seen some of the companies that you've invested in able to attract different kinds of revenue where the core business itself actually can't monetize to cover the costs of doing the great work that they're doing. And the second is a provocation. The question here is VCs pitching the problem, and do you think that VCs might be part of the problem because you are targeting exit, because you have financial returns as your goal? Obviously, you're a non-profit, so there's alternative incentives there.
I have one example that comes to mind. We have a company in our portfolio called Dimensional Energy. Their CEO is his name's Jason Selfie. He might be here actually somewhere around. But they're creating sustainable aviation fuel. Obviously, we're many years away from this being financially stable, but it needs to happen, right? And Jason, through our program and through others, was able to actually find out that there are byproducts from the development of sustainable aviation fuel that could go on to actually be monetized. This is something like he had no idea was an opportunity. And so I think this is like a real hard tech example I'm giving you, but there's a lot of interesting roads you can go down, and people are just scratching the surface about what are other ways to monetize different parts of the business that you didn't know about to start. And that's usually comes through like external experts helping and coaching.
I'm happy to take the second part of that, is around the role of VCs in this. And I think, I probably wouldn't go as far as say that VCs are the problem, but I think it's worth noting though that there's the structure of a fund or an investor and their objectives may or may not align well with the business that you're trying to build. And I think it is critical to realize where there's a disconnect, whether it's a timing related thing or it is a scale related thing. And I know lots of people have learned this the hard way, but there is such a thing as raising too much money too quickly and then needing to grow your business to a size that may not be actually the best trajectory for that business. So I think one reason why we were intentional in structuring our company as a holding company rather than a fund is to give us flexibility with permanent capital to decide how long we want to stay in something, whether we want to own and operate a project itself for 10, 15 plus years. But I think there's a role for all types of investors, and I think it is critical. Like if you're looking at capital sources, to not think of all VCs as the same, or think of VCs as the only option for funding your business.
It's a great question, so thank you. I'll ask Peter a follow-up question, which is, how was it convincing LPs to invest in water tech, and what was the challenge that you encountered there?
So it really is very personal to each LP, and sort of someone talked about understanding the black box of the other person that you're talking to understand what their motivations and incentives are. Some were very mission driven and they really wanted to contribute to water sustainability, and others didn't care. They just saw it as a great business opportunity. And it really depends. Like I was working on an impact report. One of my anchor LP doesn't care about impact reporting. Others really care a lot. So it really is just having conversation, understanding individual incentives and motivations for why they want to be a partner.
Any other questions from the audience? Questions? Yes.
So it's kind of relating to your first comments about externalities and pricing, and it's for Peter directly, and I think it's a one-word answer. Trying to word it so that I'm genuinely interested. So if we don't have a price for PFAS, if we don't have a price for carbon, clearly business plans that save water, save money, so I get that. What percentage of PFAS, carbon, or other methane-related issues in the water stream are correlated to business value propositions that make sense standalone without pricing the externality? So is it like, clearly it's cheaper to dump water if you don't have to clean it. So that's kind of like almost like a cognitive dissonance with water business plans. It's unfortunate that that's the case, but what percentage of business plans that save water are correlated to carbon or cleaning up the water or making it fresher or whatever? So it's basically, how big is the actual water solution set without pricing carbon or other pollutants?
I can answer it two ways. One is that almost no customers buy on the proposition you talked about, like cleaning the water or the carbon benefits.
Right, I assume so, yeah.
So that's zero, basically. But there are investable opportunities because there are these other benefits, right, that come along with it that are core to the provision of the service that they're in business to do. Provide clean, reliable water, right? And if it's central to their mission,
got it.
And they can
clean water is the product.
Clean water, and the water utilities have two jobs: provide clean, reliable water and pay off their debt.
Yep.
And if you can help them do one of those two things, they'll be your customer all day, every day. But they're not going to buy it for these other things unless they have to. And it sucks to be in that regulatory environment a little bit, or rely on regulation or policy for a business proposition.
I guess I was thinking about the industrial pollution streams and how are we going to address that without pricing some of these pollutants?
Yeah, I mean, they do, if it's core, if it helps them reduce cost or improve their revenue stream, or they can harvest the waste in some way for some other purpose, which is happening, right? We're starting to harvest lithium out of desalination brine, for example, right? That was a waste, 5 years ago. And today we have a lot of companies looking to, to harvest brine, to harvest lithium, which is a massive industry, or hydrogen, right? And ammonia. These used to be considered wasteful or, not profitable. Today, right, they are the product. And we're seeing a lot of companies going after these things because and I like this with a free feedstock, right? And these are free for a business that can do it in an economic way.
Questions?
Final question.
Final question.
Hi, I have a follow-up question. Thank you. Of what was asked earlier about kind of finding finance resources and kind of understanding how it works. And I'd love to understand how you guys approached asking for help, because I think that's something that can be very challenging sometimes, especially if you're an early seed stage startup and you feel like maybe there's not as much value that you can bring to the other person. What are strategies that you guys use to solicit for help?
Is the question for from the founder perspective or from the investor perspective?
From the founder perspective.
From the founder perspective, yeah. In my previous hat, before I started working on the GGRF, I was working on our energy and mobility portfolio, and I spoke daily to many startups in those spaces, right? And a lot of them, immediately knew that maybe they're not a right fit or too early, but all of us are willing to help and know the connections. And when they come to us and say, I'm having this problem or I want to talk to this person, we're all open, everyone on the team is really open to making introductions and moving things forward. And so I would just say don't hesitate, because even if you're not in an investor's portfolio, there could be a place where they want to help you to get them to a place where they're willing to invest. So I've been really shocked, especially in this space, about how helpful everyone is. And if they're not, just move on to the next one who is helpful.
It's a delightful question on which to end this. I think one of the things that founders get so consumed with is selling their business, selling to each of you as they're trying to secure investment and otherwise. There's something very beautiful about brutal honesty in this space, because investors, I think, understand how challenging it is, and in as much as they are looking for that next unicorn, they also want to work with great teams and help build great companies. I want to thank each of you for taking the opportunity to reverse pitch. I want to thank our panel for starting us off with some wonderful questions, and I want to thank our audience for hanging with us this last hour. We only 3 minutes over. We landed this plane full of sustainable aviation fuel and onto the rest of the conference. So thanks, folks. Have a great day.
So we got to hear from all the folks on stage. Just to recognize the people who are asking questions in front, if you want to learn more about innovation and entrepreneurship at the law school, go talk to Gary. Gary teaches a course on innovation and entrepreneurship. If you'd like to learn more about the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, Lindsay Martinez is the chair of the advisory board of that, the joint initiative between the School of Management and the School of the Environment. Matt teaches on climate solutions, a seminar course at Yale, and is at the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture and Storage. And Jen was the highest rated speaker in the operations seminar at the Yale School of Management in how do you transform supply chains. So if you want to learn how products get made sustainably, you can go talk to her as well. Thank you, everyone. Great to be here.